Welcome to Rev Dr Mitri Raheb from Bethlehem. Mitri, if I may call you so, is not only a long-term acquaintance and a professional colleague, but he's also a friend of many, many years. And I have had the pleasure on previous occasions to visit him in his various venues in Bethlehem. Any information that is required about Rev Dr Mitri Raheb or the document Kairos 2020 that we'll talk about now briefly in 14-15 minutes will be found in the description box of this YouTube episode. Let's start with the first question, Mitri. 2009, 11 years ago, Kairos Palestine issued a document that was entitled A Moment of Truth. 11 years later, we have another Kairos document that talks about a cry for hope. What happened between truth and hope in those 11 years?
Actually, the situation deteriorated in these 11 years. I mean, 2009, we launched the Kairos document because we felt nothing was moving. It was almost like the occupation became business as usual. And this is why we launched the document to see maybe it's high time to try to think of Palestine and help us come to peace. Now, actually, the situation is even worse on almost all levels. If you look at the international level, the rise of the Christian right, but also the rise of populism in the States, in Brazil, in India, in Russia, in China, etc. It's a very frightening world today. I mean, all accomplishment of the Second World War, of international law, human rights, Geneva Convention are being questioned now. I mean, even in the UK now, in Parliament, people were saying, I mean, even if we violate international law with Brexit, within the context of Brexit, so what's the deal? I mean, so it's a new world today. So that's internationally. On the Arab side, also today you saw that Bahrain and United Arab Emirates have signed an agreement with Israel, peace for peace, without actually really tackling the main issue, which is the Palestinian issue. And if we look at the Palestinian, intra-Palestinian context, with the division, it's also an aging leadership, etc. The situation doesn't look good.
That's quite true. And I take on board all your points. Now, you're a theologian, you're an author, you're one of the thinkers of the Palestinian Christian community. And I know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that Kairos in a theological sense means a moment of opportunity. And it is an example of what 2009 document sought for. Now, you've explained to me why you moved from a moment of truth to a cry for hope. Would you consider that the Kairos document is an example of liberation theology? It's a way of interpreting scripture differently from the way some of our sisters and brothers in the United States might read the Bible.
Yes, definitely. In our document from 2009, we talked about faith, love, and hope. And faith, we really talked about, all of these, Christian Zionism ideas that really think what's happening right now in the Holy Land is the fulfillment of the promise. And we say the fulfillment of the promise is really peace. And we are far away today from peace. And so we are trying really to read the Bible through Palestinian eyes, through the eyes of people who are living under occupation, are suffering. And for us, the Bible was written in that language because the Bible was always the text of a persecuted minority that is surrounded by empires, and they are trying to stick to their faith in their God, who seems to be very weak.
Good point. Now, I enjoyed both documents. I was much more involved with the 2009 one, as you know, than I was with the 2021. Now, reading the new document of 2020, A Cry for Hope, what struck me is that you're talking about something called status confessionis. You're talking about the German pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who incidentally, Mitri, is one of my favorite theologians. You're also talking about the WCC, the World Council of Churches, and the way it combats racism. Now, my question to you, is it that you are in this document, which was signed by the Latin Rite Patriarch Emeritus of Jerusalem, Michel Sabah, as well as the coordinator Rifat Qassis, but I know that you and others have worked on it. Are you saying, therefore, with those examples and the way you're talking about the churches confessing that there is apartheid and there is racism within Palestinian society today vis-a-vis the occupation?
Yes. I mean, let me first say that the difference between the 2009 and 2020 document is that the first one was a pure Palestinian one.
Mm-hmm.
It was the Palestinian clergy and it was the Palestinian lay leader from different churches that came together in an ecumenical forum, ecumenical spirit, to try to discern what is God trying to tell us in this context, 2009. The 2020 document is an international document. It was drafted by also, friends from the international community, because we have today a broad international coalition, a global Kairos in over 30 countries. So we have to keep this difference in mind. And within this context, the example of Dietrich Bonhoeffer came up. He's also one of my favorite theologians. What is really important with Dietrich Bonhoeffer is that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of few theologians who had the guts, but also the theological brain to resist Hitler and the regime. Because unfortunately, the majority of people in the church were going with the flow. Usually church hierarchies, they don't resist really the
They
regime.
play politics, Mitri.
Exactly. And so they really go with the flow. And this is so dangerous. And Bonhoeffer was one of few who decided, no, now it's time to speak up. That's the one thing. The other thing is, which is important with Bonhoeffer, is that he understood that as a theologian, we have always to think of the power balance or the power imbalance. For him, it was very clear that Hitler and his regime, they had all the power, while the Jewish community were the powerless. Now, today, in Israel-Palestine, the situation has changed dramatically, because today Israel is one of the top 7 most militarized countries in the world. And I think today, many churches who seems to be pro-Israeli, it's not because they have learned from history, but I think because also they decided to go with the flow, because standing up is a costly matter. And this is why actually Bonhoeffer talked about the costly grace. I mean, to stand up, to be prophetic, to say a word of truth to those in power has a huge cost.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Bonhoeffer also lose his life as a result of his stand?
Right, he died in prison, and his letters in the prison actually are some of the most powerful letters that came out, and especially talking about hope again in the cell under Hitler.
Mitri, you just mentioned something which is very important. You made a distinction between the 2009 document, which is a purely Palestinian moment of opportunity or Kairos, and the 2021, which is much more international. And I know that Kairos is represented in many countries. People who would look at the links in my description box will see all those countries and the work that has been done across different churches worldwide. Now, I was discussing Kairos 2020 with a friend of mine, and he said to me, he said, Harry, Palestinians and Christians in the Arab world should learn that salvation doesn't come from a Western political agenda, that it comes from the self, that we as Palestinians, and I'm including myself in this category now, we Palestinians should struggle ourselves rather than rely on what the West, the Western church, the Western political powers can do us. Because to be honest with you, if you look at the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the West has not graced us with many solutions.
Right, right. I mean, yes and no. Yes, because we have a big responsibility as Palestinians, and I'm against actually just waiting for salvation to come, riding on a white horse. It will not come for sure, and it will not come just from the West like that. And for me, there is a difference between hope and optimism. This is why, the title of the document is Cry for Hope, a call to decisive action. Because for me, hope is what we do, is not what we see. And so this is a call for action to us, also Palestinians in the first place. But the problem is that the international community is part of the problem. The Israeli occupation continues not only because the Palestinians are weak or not united, but because, the US gives Israel every year $3.8 billion in weapons and support. It is because, the Europeans, they have bad conscience because of the Holocaust. And so they keep supporting Israel. They don't have the guts to stand up for justice, but to pay lip service to justice, which are two different things.
Yeah.
So the international community is part of the problem. And so what we are saying here is that we want the international community at least to start thinking to becoming part of the solution rather on,
part of the problem.
Exactly.
Mitri, a point that I wanted to raise with you, because I think it's important for my viewers and our European understanding. We know, you know far more than I do actually, that the overwhelming majority of Palestinians in the occupied territories are Muslim. This document is a strictly Christian document crafted by Christians and for Christian churches. Considering the relations between Christians and Muslims in Palestine and the diaspora, how do you reconcile those two together? Because surely we're not talking about a separatist Christian movement.
Correct. Yeah, you are right. There is a difference, say, between South Africa and the Kairos there, where the majority are Christians, overwhelming majority, and Palestine, where the Christians are less than 2%. And yet, Christians play an important role. Why? Because Christians, they are a bridge to the ecumenical movement worldwide. And as I said, the ecumenical movement or the international community is part of the problem. And we think that Christians at least can raise their voice because of this bridge to the Western world to, to try to wake up the international community. And I think our Muslim compatriot here, they understand this important role of Christians. But secondly, if you look at the document from 2020, many issues are not really religious. I mean, affirming the Palestinian rights to resist. This is not a Christian thing. This is, I mean, it applies for everyone. Opposing anti-Semitism applies for everyone. Demand, international law, human rights. This is for everyone. So actually, I mean, the bulk of the document speaks a language that is not too Christian, but it has that human element. It has that, it's the right approach, rights-based approach, which I think is really, is a common ground for Christians, Muslims, and even Jews, because there are actually many Jewish friends who agree with us on these points.
And actually, Mitri, if I might just add a comment to confirm what you've said, across the Arab world, if you look at the political history of the Arab world, there have been many Arab Christians who have been at the forefront of freedom movements and liberation. So in a sense, what you say works very well in the context of Palestine as well. I'm going to finish with one last question. And you gave me bread or food for that question when you talked about this new 2020 Kairos document, which is a global justice document, calling for decisive action. Now, in a couple of words, and I know it's a big ask, but in a couple of words, what can Palestinians do today? And what can Arabs across the Arab world think of in terms of resisting an occupation? You mentioned normalization. You mentioned the fact that the Palestinian question now is almost marginalized in the political imagination of the Arab and the global world. What decisive action would happen? You're sharing this document with Europe and the West. One of the points of the document is BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Well, that is something that Israel opposes fiercely, and the West gets a little bit uncomfortable doing something that Israel opposes so fiercely. So what is Mitri Raheb's definition of decisive action? Not a list of actions, but a philosophy, a theosophy of action.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in this context, from the Palestinian side, the most important decisive action, first of all, is resilience. That's important, I mean, at the end of the day, we have 6.5 million Palestinians living in the Holy Land between the river Jordan and the Mediterranean. And they are not going to disappear. And this is really very important because it's the demography that matters. Israel right now, it's trying to fully control the geography, but they were not able to control the demography. And so this is for me important. That's one. Number two, if we look at the international community, it is really time and I think some people are beginning to understand that you cannot just keep saying we are for a two-state solution, why actually Israel is taking over all the geography. It just doesn't work, because if Israel controls the geography and the demography, half of it is Palestinian, you have apartheid. And apartheid is something that nobody can actually defend. It failed in South Africa after 50 years, and it will not be possible to keep on here, because at the end of the day, there will come a day where the Israeli will not be able to look into the mirror and to see themselves what they have done to themselves. And so we need really to save Israel from this apartheid and to save the Palestinians from this occupation. And I think now it's high time to do that, because if we don't do it right now, there will be at least the two coming generations of Israel and Palestinians who will be suffering under this apartheid system.
I'm going to ask you a final question, which requires a one-word answer.
Okay.
And then we stop the recording, but we continue the chat. In view of everything that is happening in Palestine today, you're in Bethlehem, but you also have contacts within the whole of Palestine. You have contacts within the Arab world. I know you were recently in Doha, Qatar also, where you gave a paper. I enjoy actually following your movements because they are quite fast. Now, if you look at all of this put together, is Mitri Raheb today optimistic, pessimistic, or pessimistic?
None of those.
I said one word. You're going to give me a sentence now.
No, hopeful. And hope is what we do.
I really like that answer. And if you don't mind, even though this is a Western audience largely that will listen to this conversation, I'm going to switch into Arabic, my Armenian Arabic, by saying "Ma binshab'a al-hadith ma'ak," which translated means I can go on and on, but unfortunately there is a limit to time. So Reverend Dr. Mitri Raheb, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Harry.